There is a line on an Admiralty chart from 1820 that should feel ordinary, and does not. It runs along the edge of what we now call the Antarctic Peninsula. At first glance it is just a coastal trace. But the longer you look at it, the less it feels like the edge of a blank white continent just entering human knowledge. It feels like coastline. Hard coastline. Broken, angular, uneven, almost familiar. Not a vague wall of weather at the bottom of the earth, but land with structure. The kind of line sailors draw when they believe they are looking at something solid enough to return to. That is where this investigation begins. Because the official story sounds simple. Antarctica was the last continent to be discovered. In 1820, through fog, storm, and sea ice, the first explorers finally reached the frozen margin of an unknown southern land. Over the decades that followed, expedition after expedition filled in the map. That is the accepted sequence. It is tidy. It is coherent. It appears to explain everything. Reasonable. Except the earliest material does not always read like first contact with a uniformly sealed ice world. In January of 1820, Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen, commanding the Russian expedition with Vostok and Mirny, reported sightings near the Antarctic Circle that many historians treat as among the first confirmed observations of the continent. Days later, Edward Bransfield of the Royal Navy sighted the mountainous coast of the northern Antarctic Peninsula. Nathaniel Palmer followed in the same year. These names are well known. The dates are well known. But the texture of some of the earliest descriptions is not. Not just ice. Not just barrier. Not just frozen distance. Again and again, the first encounters carry details that feel harder, darker, and more topographic than the later public image of Antarctica tends to allow. Black rock against ice, elevated ridges, sharply cut coastlines, mountain forms, openings of water, exposed surfaces, recognizable edges. In places, the language sounds less like men confronting a perfectly sealed polar abstraction and more like sailors trying to make sense of a difficult coast. That difference matters. Because if the first visible Antarctica was not blank whiteness, but an expressive coastal margin with exposed rock, mountain relief, and broken water, then the modern image of Antarctica may not have been discovered all at once. It may have been stabilized later. There is an obvious objection, and it is fair. Antarctica is not uniformly buried beneath featureless ice, and never has been. Along the peninsula and in multiple coastal sectors, mountains break through. Summer melt opens water. Wind strips some areas clean. Navigators approaching the comparatively milder maritime sector of the peninsula absolutely could have seen exposed ground. That explanation is real. But it does not resolve the deeper problem. It only moves it. Because the real problem is not whether early explorers saw rock. Of course they did. The real problem is what happened to the meaning of those observations afterward. Once you read the early material closely, a pattern begins to emerge. The first layer of the story is direct encounter. The second is classification. And classification has a way of smoothing difficult first impressions into safer categories. Exposed rock becomes incidental geology. Unusual coastal definition becomes seasonal luck. Sharp shoreline recognition becomes navigational convenience. Anything that suggests a less ice-dominated margin gets absorbed into the larger identity of Antarctica as frozen extremity. The records were not erased. They were reduced. I am not claiming Bellingshausen or Bransfield sailed into a functioning harbor and found columns standing in the snow. The documents do not say that. But they do suggest something more unsettling. The first encounters with Antarctica do not sit comfortably inside the later myth of a pure white blank. The later story is cleaner than the first one. And the chart is only the beginning. Long before 1820, Europe had already imagined a southern land. Terra Australis occupied the lower reaches of old atlases for centuries because many believed some balancing southern mass had to exist. Much of that cartography was speculative. Some of it was wrong. But speculation leaves a structure behind. It prepares institutions to receive a landmass not as an impossible revelation, but as the confirmation of something already half imagined. That matters because the early 19th century sits in a transition point. The old age of conjectural cartography had not fully disappeared, but the new age of disciplined hydrographic science had begun. Maps were supposed to become tighter, cleaner, more empirical. And yet Antarctica enters that record with a strange dual character. It is both unknown and oddly legible. Inaccessible, yet interpretable. Seen only in fragments, but those fragments are precise enough to anchor bearings, mountain profiles, routes, names, and future returns. Taken one by one, each of those facts has a reasonable explanation. Taken together, they describe something more difficult, not simply discovery, but narrative stabilization. Look at the Antarctic Peninsula itself. It is the sector most central to the earliest sustained sightings, and it is anomalous in exactly the wrong way for the official image that came later. It reaches toward South America. It is shaped by maritime influence. It contains islands, exposed mountain chains, seasonally broken sea ice, narrow passages, visible relief, and recurring coastal complexity. Today none of that is controversial. But place that reality back into 1820 and the problem sharpens. If the first Antarctica seen in detail was one of the continent's most expressive margins, then the first image of Antarctica may have been less frozen nothing than difficult coast. And once a coast becomes a coast, other questions appear. How much could be seen from offshore in clear conditions? Which profiles were sketched before they were simplified into hydrographic shorthand? Which rough details were later treated as noise because they fit badly into Antarctica's emerging identity as the world's final sealed zone? How many first impressions sounded historical before they were normalized into geology? This is where the language of edge matters. Early expeditions repeatedly describe contrast, dark material against ice, openings in place of total obstruction, hard boundaries instead of endless whiteness. And boundaries matter because they are where categories fail. A continent that exists only as ice belongs fully to nature. A continent with visible coasts, recesses, ridges, and interruptions begins to feel layered. It begins to feel as though it has a surface history. Then there are the charts themselves. Not the fantasy maps people misuse online, but 19th century route sketches, Admiralty charts, coastal notations, and later revisions. Hydrography is a sober science. Bearings are fixed carefully. Headlands are established against islands. Mountain silhouettes are compared from changing positions at sea. Yet some coastal delineations arrived with surprising confidence considering the conditions: storm, pack ice, poor visibility, drifting vessels, little opportunity to land, and still the line remains. The coastline is there. The angularity is there. The structure holds. It was not erased by later science. It was normalized by it. And then something even larger happened. By the 1830s and 1840s, southern exploration intensified. Most importantly, James Clark Ross confronted the immense glaciated wall that now bears his name. The Ross Ice Shelf was and is a genuine continental shock. Vast, severe, overwhelming, almost abstract in scale. But once that image entered the public story, it began to reorganize everything around it. The barrier became Antarctica. The wall became the continent. The most overwhelming image swallowed the more ambiguous first impressions. Earlier reports of exposed land, broken coasts, and geologically expressive margins were not deleted. They were made secondary. The fortress image won. That pattern is not unique to Antarctica. One dominant scientific truth can become so visually powerful that it flattens adjacent complexity. Antarctica is ice. Yes. But Antarctica is ice is not the same statement as Antarctica was first encountered only as ice. The difference is small on paper and enormous in implication. Then modern science complicates the story even further. Because later research did not produce a simpler continent. It produced a more irregular one. Antarctica contains ice-free zones. The McMurdo Dry Valleys remain the most famous example, a polar desert inside the world's most ice-associated landmass. Coastal East Antarctica includes wind-scoured rock exposures. Blue ice areas, bare ridges, volcanic terrain, fossil-bearing strata, and ancient landscapes buried beneath later ice are all real. None of this proves an old world. But it changes the psychological architecture of the continent. Antarctica is not one surface. It is layers. Interruptions. Masks. Exposures. Once you accept that the continent has always contained a more complex surface history than the simplified public image suggests, the earliest descriptions begin to feel less trivial. Those black shorelines stop sounding like incidental anomalies. They start sounding like the first surviving edge of a chronology that later had to be translated into safer language. That does not require a dramatic conspiracy. Antarctica's modern ceiling can be explained through geopolitics, logistics, scientific specialization, remote archives, and a public trained to imagine one thing instead of another. A continent can be sealed by narrative before it is sealed by law. That may be why some of the strangest material survives only in marginal places, sketches with too much relief, coastal notations that feel more certain than conditions should permit, repeated emphasis on exposed land in sectors later folded into the generic category of frozen frontier, and the subtle archival fate of such observations. Not denied. Not falsified. Just subordinated beneath the elegance of the ice story. And this is where the phrase, "old world," becomes powerful, even when handled carefully. Not because we can prove that an intact Antarctic civilization once stood in plain sight on the coast. We cannot. But because the sequence keeps raising the same harder possibility, that the Antarctic margin visible to early 19th century observers may have preserved traces of a world later generations were trained to read as non-historical by default. A symmetrical recess becomes erosion. A raised formation becomes geology. A route becomes accident. A cluster of exposed shapes becomes just rock. Sometimes that judgment is correct. Often it probably is. But interpretation is never fully neutral once one explanatory system stabilizes institutions and another destabilizes time itself. That is what makes the early record so difficult to dismiss. It does not provide proof in the sensational sense. It provides resistance. Resistance to simplification. Resistance to the idea that Antarctica entered modern consciousness as a perfect frozen abstraction. The earliest witnesses seem to be describing something with edges sharp enough to invite recognition. Something visible enough to sketch. Structured enough to return to. As though they were not only staring into weather, but approaching the exposed remains of a place already in the process of being covered. The more Antarctica was studied, the more the public image of it became simpler, not more complex. Science discovered intricacy. Public memory received emptiness. Normally knowledge thickens a place. Here, somehow, knowledge refined the continent into a symbol, white, silent, sealed, terminal. But symbols are poor containers for anomalies. So the investigation keeps returning to that line from 1820. That hard coastline at the bottom of the world. Drawn before Antarctica had fully become what modern imagination now requires it to be. The official explanation is that these were brave men glimpsing a hostile unknown and beginning the work of charting it. That is true, as far as it goes. Reasonable. Except the first coast they saw may already have been something more complicated than the story that replaced it. Not a fantasy kingdom preserved in full view. Not a ready-made proof of ruins beneath every glacier. Something more difficult than that. A chronological fracture. The possibility that Antarctica's modern identity was imposed after contact, not simply discovered in it. That the ice narrative, however true in geological terms, also functioned as a covering language. A way of converting exposed complexity into frozen finality. And perhaps that is why the strangest part of the story is also the quietest. The record survived. The date survived. The chart survived. The black rock against ice survived. The first impression survived. What changed was not the existence of the material, but the frame around it. The coast remained. The interpretation narrowed. And that may be the real seal. Not the destruction of evidence, but its survival inside a stronger summary. That is why the earliest Antarctic record still feels unstable under close reading. Not because it shouts. Because it resists. Quietly. Persistently. In the wrong details. In the hard edges. In the black material breaking through the ice. In the uncomfortable fact that the first men to reach the continent may not have encountered an empty final world at all, but the visible margin of something older already disappearing beneath the explanation that came after it.